Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is a free tutorial for the Olympus E-M1 Mark II. It's a big tutorial, but you don't have to watch the whole thing. You can skip around. So if you've worked with other Olympus cameras before, you probably know some of it. Check the description for a full table of contents so you can jump right to the part you're most interested in. If you have another camera, if you want to send a tutorial like this to a friend of yours, tell them to go to sdp.io/tutorial, where we have tutorials for just about every modern camera. More than like 30 cameras are there. First up, I'm going to go over the physical parts of the camera. This is a $2,000 camera body, so I'm going to assume that it's not your first camera and you've danced this dance a couple of times before, but I do want to cover a couple of good points. The battery here is new. It's different from the original E-M1, so you can't share those two batteries. It's nice and big. As you line it up, you'll see the 4 contacts inside the body there. Basically, you'll be lining up the contacts with the front of the camera and then sliding it all the way in. I always try putting it in backwards, which is why specifically I mentioned that. The camera comes with 1 battery, and it's generally good enough to go through the whole day. So if you're the type who never forgets to charge your battery, you can get by on that 1 battery. I've always been able to shoot all day and then go back to the hotel and charge it up when I'm traveling. If you're the type who sometimes forgets, or you want to be prepared for an emergency, you don't ever want to run out, definitely pick up a second battery, and you can do that using this sdp.io link. When you use those links, it helps support us. All those sdp.io links are just our own website. You can also add a battery grip to it that will allow you to put 2 batteries in at once, thus doubling your battery life without having to ever change the battery. You can pick it up here. It also gives you a vertical grip, so you can hold it like that. I personally don't like vertical grips. I want to talk about the lenses. You can attach a lot of different lenses to it, but there's one particular trick with the Olympus lenses that I think is worth mentioning, and that is the way that they switch from autofocus to manual focus. There's this ring here that you pull down, and when you pull it towards the lens, it now goes into manual focus mode. So you can see the distance markings here, and when it's out like this, it's in autofocus mode. That is the single biggest cause of confusion in the Olympus world, because I can't tell you how many times I picked up one of these cameras and I've been like, oh, why wouldn't it autofocus? What's going on? And then I just realized that this has been accidentally pushed. And everybody I hand the camera to, this inevitably happens. It gets accidentally pushed. So when your camera won't autofocus, just be sure you push that ring back out. There's also a little function button. LFN, I think, stands for little function button. Lens function. So you can program this to do something, whatever you want it to do, a bunch of different things. I have never used that, so I probably won't go over it. Let's talk about the SD cards, the memory cards, the digital film in this camera. This camera supports 2, which is kind of a requirement for professional use, but there's a trick to it. They're not exactly the same. Card 1 here is what's called a UHS 2 slot. UHS 2 SD cards have these 2 little rows of thingies on the back, and that makes it read and write, allows it to read and write much faster than the standard SD cards, UHS 1 cards, which only have the 1 row there. Slot 1 supports UHS 2, slot 2 is only UHS 1. A UHS 2 card can be used in either UHS 2 or 1 slots. You can put any card in any of the 2 slots. So don't sweat it. You can just use all your existing cards. If you didn't know about this, it probably wasn't a problem at all. But if you ever run into buffering problems where you're shooting quickly and then the camera stalls, it starts saying, oh, I can't shoot yet, I'm writing to the memory card. You can help alleviate that by using a UHS 2 card in slot 1. It will only help you if you're not writing simultaneously to both cards, because no matter what type of card you put into slot 2, it's going to be a little bit slower. If you want to get the best performance, use a UHS 2 card in slot 1. You can visit this link to check out some UHS 2 cards. Bigger is better, always, especially if you're using high-res mode on this. Those 80 megapixel RAW files are massive, and you can easily fill up a 128 gig SD card on a trip. So a 256 gig SD card is definitely not too much. If you're going to be traveling a week and you don't want to have to worry about filling up your card, we tend to use 256 gig cards. Obviously, smaller capacities work okay too. But save yourself some money and get just a standard SD card for slot 2. If you want better performance when you're importing the memory cards onto your computer and you have one of those UHS 2 cards, you can get a specific UHS 2 reader and that will speed things along a little bit. I just wanted to mention it. This will get you an UHS 2 reader. Our SD card actually came with a UHS 2 reader, and you do see a little bit better performance out of it, but it's not that big of a deal. Before we move on from the SD cards, I want to show you how to write to both card slots simultaneously. The reason you might write every picture to both those two card slots is that SD cards fail, and not often. We have an SD card or a memory card fail, I don't know, once every couple of years probably. But you know, we've been at it for 15 years since the beginning of digital photography, so we've seen quite a few cards fail. And if you're just out goofing around, it's not a big deal. But if you're shooting somebody's wedding, or if you've traveled around the world and those pictures are really important to you, then that card failure can be devastating. So for that reason, anytime I'm serious about my pictures, I'm writing to both card slots. I just wanted to explain that importance. Lots of people have been shooting for decades and they've never had a SD card fail, but I've been driving for decades and I've never been in a serious car accident, and I still put my seatbelt on every day. Just because an accident hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it can't. SD cards can and do fail. So if you want it to write to both card slots, you're going to be using this trick a lot. I'm going to hit OK, and it will bring up this kind of quick reference screen on the back. And as you can see here, in the lower left corner, you see that little, what looks like a little document? Hit that, and it saves settings. So now I can use this front dial here, the main dial here, to scroll through different settings. So by default, it's at just a single little document, and that means that it's only going to be writing to the first card. No redundancy, meaning if your first card fails, you lose all your pictures. Scroll that front dial, and here you can see two of them. That means it's going to overflow from one to the other. After it fills up the first card, it will write to the second card. And now we have two options here that are redundant. See how it's showing pick a card/card? That means it will write to both cards simultaneously, but with two different behaviors. Okay, there are a bunch of different SD card write modes, possibly too many, because it gets to be really confusing trying to remember what they're doing. You see when it shows card/card, that means that you can configure RAW to one and JPEG to the other, literally by just clicking them and then scrolling through the options using the main dial here. So for example, I could write RAW to the first card and JPEG to the second card, which is not a bad idea because the first card, if you use UHS 2, is faster. Therefore, the bigger RAW files, it can handle them. But the second card won't become bottlenecked if you're writing JPEGs to it. If you write RAW to both, they're both going to be operating at the slower performance of the UHS 1 card. So that's a good way to do it if you want the optimal performance. If you want to be sure you have a backup of RAW files and you don't have to resort to using a JPEG file, then you'll want to go over here to this bottom left corner and select not the slash, but the card equals card. Now this is always going to write the same file to both cards, and you'll probably want that to be a RAW file. And I'm scrolling with the front dial here. A note about the JPEGs, you can see it gives you the option for L, M, and small. That's large, medium, and small. You probably always want to write large because they're only 20 megapixels. And then within the large file, you can see you can choose from F or N. F is fine, which means less compression. So LF is the best quality JPEG. But of course, you will usually want to shoot with a RAW file. So scrolling down to this, you see two cards equal each other, and that means it's always going to write the same file type to both cards. The other option you have, you see there's a little up and down arrow as I flip between those two options. This gets really confusing. The up arrow, you can think of it as being optimistic. If one card is full, it will keep writing to the card with available space. If you choose the option with the down arrow, there we go, the down arrow, you can think of that as pessimistic. If one card becomes full, it will not write to any card. And that ensures that every picture you take is written to both cards, just in case you're the type who's like, even if one card is full, I don't ever want to take a picture without having it backed up. I'd rather know about it so I can swap the cards out or something else. Whew. This is a fantastically complex camera. Olympus is good in that they give you a ton of options, but at the same time, it makes it kind of hard to remember all these things. I had to stop and look that up in the manual. If you look for Olympus E-M1 Mark II manual, you can find the PDF, and it's good to keep that on your smartphone. Save it to your phone so you can look it up. Let's go over some of the physical ports on the camera. I already showed you the memory cards on the same side over here. Under this little rubber flap, you'll see a port for a remote. That's could be useful for things like triggering the shutter without having to touch the camera or setting up an external timer. But the fact is those features are pretty much built into the camera, so I've never had to use that. On the other side of the camera, we have an array of ports here. The top one here is the microphone port. This takes a standard 2-ring mic port. I'll suggest a microphone at the end of this video, a lav mic that I like to use. The next one is a headphone jack, so you could use just about any type of headphone in here. Note that you can't use one of the combination microphone headphones that might come with your smartphone. They just won't work in here. And then this bottom port has 2 different ports underneath it. The top one is a micro HDMI port. You'll probably never use that. You could hook it up to a TV if you wanted to get a micro HDMI to HDMI cable and then do like a slideshow directly from your camera to your TV. But that's not how people really look at pictures. Most people just rather look at it on the back of the camera. The bottom one is a USB-C port, so a nice fast USB port that you could use for computer tethering. Again, something you might not necessarily do. You could also transfer pictures directly through a USB cable from the camera to the computer. Me personally, I generally prefer to use a USB card reader, however. On the bottom here, I'll just mention this. If you get the USB grip, or if you get the vertical grip, you would pull this off and it would expose a couple of contacts, like electrical contacts. The screen here is really nice. It's pretty obvious. It flips out from the side and then rotates like this. So kind of with it facing forward like that, that's like a selfie mode, which is terribly useful if you're taking a selfie. Or if you're filming somebody and you want to show them how they look in the frame, you can flip it around real quickly. Most of the time, I'll keep it flipped back like this so I can view the images, review the images on the back of the screen. Sometimes, if I'm going to be traveling with it, I want to make sure the screen doesn't get scratched. I'll flip it and it will be protected like that. That pretty much covers it for the ports. Quick note about the firmware. Olympus does occasionally release firmware updates that either fix bugs or add new features to the camera. They've been great with other cameras. So just Google Olympus E-M1 Mark II firmware and make sure you have the latest firmware on it. I'm going to talk more about customizations later in the video, but there's one particular customization that I have found terribly useful as I've been using this camera. The on-off switch by default is over here on the left. So when you turn the camera on, you just do that, on-off. I hate that position of the switch. I generally love the Olympus controls, but I like to be able to flip the camera on and off with my right hand, just because I like to be able to shoot one-handed. Sometimes something's in your left hand, and if you do this, then there's just no way you can reach the on-off switch. So Olympus actually allows you to reassign the power switch, which is cool. I've never seen a camera do this before. So let's hit the menu button here and we'll go into the pretty good menu system. It's not bad at all. And let's go down to the gear icon and scroll down to, you can see them under B here, FN lever, power lever. This is the function lever, and this is the power lever up here. So as I select that, I'll scroll to the right, and now you can see, what do you want the FN lever to do here? You can scroll through various different options, and it's good about describing it to you. And if you choose to enable this, then this will become the power lever. So position 1 is power on, and that's generally what I prefer. So I've set this, and now when I flip it down, the camera comes on. So this feels very intuitive to me. I grab the camera, I flip my thumb down, and it powers on. That works better than this, but if you ever hand the camera to somebody else, they're going to be reaching for the power over here because it's labeled on off, and they're not going to know what's going on. So if you do that, just be prepared to tell everybody in your life what the power switch now actually is. And I'll tell you why that's important. It relates to the battery. The battery life is great on this, but the battery life is going to be a lot better if you manually turn it off and on. And you can see as I turn it on, it comes up really quickly. So it's not like you're waiting for a minute for it to power up. Just get in the habit of taking a picture, turning it off. Pick it up, turn it on, take your picture, turn it back off, and you'll get much longer use out of it. Let's actually talk about taking a picture. We're finally there. Take a picture is the usual thing. You'll depress the shutter button halfway and the camera will focus, and then you'll push it all the way and it will take a picture. And you can see by default, it focuses in single AF mode. It doesn't track moving subjects, and it snaps a picture, just one, without taking multiple pictures. There's actually a lot more to it than this. It has a live view screen at the back and a viewfinder up here. If you hold it up to your eye, it will automatically switch between the two. If you don't like that auto switching, if you push this button here, it will turn off the back screen and only use the viewfinder. So for me, I'm almost always just a viewfinder guy, so I like that. Now, it's not displaying a live feed on the back screen, it's just providing me information about the image. But every time I hold it up to my eye, I see the actual feed. So I'll turn that off just to make it easier for us to film. When you are using the viewfinder, it's very important that you know about this diopter here. The diopter is your glasses prescription built into the camera. So you can move it up or down until everything looks sharp. So what you'll do is you'll hold the camera up to your eye and don't look at the things you focus on. Look at the numbers at the bottom of the display and then move that diopter until everything is sharp for you. Now, if you ever pick up your camera and it seems like it won't focus, that everything's just always out of focus, check that diopter. That's the most common cause, if somebody's accidentally hit that diopter. This allows you to take off your glasses and shoot without your glasses and still see things crystal clear. If you and someone else who's using the camera have different vision, then you might have to adjust this diopter every time you trade it off. While you're using the back screen here, you can control the information that you see. So you can see by default, it's showing me the shutter speed, the aperture, the exposure compensation, and a few other things. I can hit this info button here to hide that information or show a few different bits of information. So as I'm pushing it multiple times, it's oscillating between different information. Here you can see I'm seeing a histogram. Check chapter 4 in my book, Stunning Digital Photography, if you want to understand those better. I'll hit it again, and now it's showing me a virtual level. This is fantastic for all types of photography. And it just makes sure that your camera's actually level. Me personally, I've never taken a level picture, but that really helps. And if I push it again, that just goes away. So for the most part, it will do those exact same things when you have your eye to the viewfinder. Just put your eye to the viewfinder and hit that info button. Let's talk about the depth of field preview. It's this button on the front, the lower button. As I push that, it's going to give me a depth of field preview. So right now you can see the screen is just out of focus, right? As I push that, it's going to actually shut the lens down to the aperture that I've selected here, which is currently f10. We'll talk about aperture in just a little bit, but if you already know, depth of field is how much of the frame is in or out of focus. So you can see I focus in the background there, but you would think from looking at the live view that the foreground is going to be completely out of focus, but because I'm at f10, it's going to snap into focus. So with the depth of field button held down, I can adjust the aperture value and see in real time what my depth of field is going to be. So you can see as I'm not changing the focusing point, because the background is staying in focus there. But as I increase the f-stop from f2.8 all the way to f22, you can see that's how much of a difference it makes. That's really useful for macro photography, for anytime you want to get something in the foreground and background in focus, and I love that you can see it and not have the display get dim like it does on a DSLR. Touchscreen modes. There's an icon over here when you have this display set up that changes what the touchscreen will do. If you hate the touchscreen, touch that until it shows a little finger with a line through it. That means touchscreen does nothing. There is no touchscreen. If you have touchscreen with the box, that means you will touch to focus. Wherever you touch, it will snap into focus. If you have touchscreen with the shutter button, that means when you touch, it will focus and then snap a picture. You know how that's really useful? If you're taking a selfie, you can flip it around and touch it. If you're holding it out, maybe you're holding it over a crowd at a concert, you can reach up and just focus and snap a picture all at one time. So that's usually what I leave that on. I never have problems with it accidentally triggering. Speaking of selfies, this camera actually has a Selfie Assist. Look, none of us are above selfies. People love selfies, right? With Selfie Assist, it will automatically come up when you flip the screen forward. So there you can see my cameraman Justin in the background there. Let's zoom in and see if we can get a selfie together. Now you can see a little shutter button there. It's automatically finding my face, and then I'll just touch that shutter, and it will wait a couple of seconds. And that's your Selfie Assist. So because it's waiting, I have a chance to pull my hand back and get in a little better place. I'm totally using these pictures, Justin. And then it even reviews the picture because, you know, everybody's going to be like, oh, let me see the picture. Selfie Assist, cool little feature. I wish other cameras had that. Another feature related to shooting is various image stabilization modes. So this camera actually has two different types of stabilization. It has stabilization in a lot of the lenses, not all the lenses, but a lot of the lenses will have image stabilization. This model doesn't, but for example, this big lens here has this image stabilization lens on the side, on, off. But most of the shorter Olympus lenses don't have image stabilization. Instead, most of the time you'll be relying on sensor stabilization, which cancels out camera shake, because your hands are never completely still, by moving the sensor to compensate for it. It works fantastically. You can literally take handheld shots at like 2 seconds with this thing, especially at wider angles. It's amazing. But you might want to understand the different image stabilization modes, because if you're trying to pan, for example, if you're following a running deer, it will try to cancel out this horizontal movement. So if you are panning either vertically or horizontally, you want to change the image stabilization mode so it won't be trying to fight that movement. Here's how you do that. Let's flip the screen back around. To change the image stabilization mode, you'll hit the OK button to bring up the shortcut menu and then select it there. And when I click it, you'll see we can pick between the different modes. So Auto IS should detect your panning automatically, but if you ever find that's a problem, you could set it to vertical shake, image stabilization for when you're panning horizontally, it'll cancel out vertical shake, or horizontal shake, image stabilization for when you're panning up and down, which you probably won't ever do. But generally, Auto IS should be just fine. That'll even work with adapted lenses, including like third-party lenses, some of which I'll recommend in a little bit. Right below that is the MIS. This is Movie IS. And if you select that, you'll see by default, it will stabilize your video, not just with sensor shift, but with digital stabilization, where if the frame moves too much, it will actually shift where it's reading the sensor from. It's just two different forms of stabilization. Sometimes that can look a little wonky, especially if you're walking. So you might consider turning that digital stabilization off and just using the sensor shift stabilization when you're walking. But go ahead and give it a try, because some people like it. It kind of depends on the focal length of the lens too. If you ever don't have quite enough reach out of your lens, the digital teleconverter is really useful. All this will do is it will just crop your image for you automatically. So you're not going to get a better picture by using the digital teleconverter. It's not going to be sharper, but that digital teleconverter will allow you to zoom in an extra 50% in the viewfinder. So often when I'm shooting sports, especially at the long end of the field, I just won't be able to get close enough. I'll turn on the digital teleconverter and it's going to be writing, I think, like an 8 megapixel file instead of a 20 megapixel file. So my files are smaller, which is better, it writes them faster, but also I get that full zoom in the viewfinder, and sometimes it saves me a lot of cropping in Lightroom later. So it's just a feature that I really like. Hit the menu button here, and then on the camera 1 menu item, scroll down to digital teleconverter, select that and turn that on. You can also, if you find yourself using that feature, you can assign it to a shortcut button, so you can really quickly switch between them. I was able to switch fast enough that when the players were on the far end of the field, I would turn it on, and when they got closer, I would turn it off to get that extra resolution out of it. So now that we've covered the basics of taking a picture, let's actually review a picture. Let's see if we roll back. Oh, what a handsome selfie. To review pictures, of course, you'll hit this play button in the lower left corner here. You can push the info button to show different information about the image. You can see if I push it, it will actually show me the histogram broken into red, blue, and green, and then the luminance channel is the white there. And in this display, I can see all of the different settings. You don't have to review pictures as often on a mirrorless camera if you're switching from DSLRs where you have to chimp everything, because you pretty much saw the image when you were taking it. So that's a really great advantage of it. I will say you can see the Wi-Fi in the corner here. If you want to quickly share a picture, you can just touch Wi-Fi and jump right into that, and then from here you'll be able to connect right to your camera. I will show you how to connect to the camera a little later. For now, we'll skip that. Now we're going to go over the different modes of the camera. Program mode, aperture mode, shutter priority mode, manual mode, bulb mode. I'm going to cover these really, really briefly. I'm going to assume you already know most of the stuff. Aperture priority, causes the main dial here to control the aperture. If you aren't familiar, this is an aperture. The aperture is built into the lens. High f-stop numbers like f22 mean a small opening, lets less light through, and it gives you high background sharpness. High f-stop number, high background sharpness. Let's open that up to say f14, f28. Lets in a lot of light, but it gives you less background sharpness. Low f-stop number, low background sharpness. For detailed information about how aperture works, check chapter 4 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography, over there. To select aperture priority mode, take the mode dial here and put it on A. The mode dial has a locking button in the center there, so if it doesn't turn like that, you'll have to push it and pop it up. I have never had this dial turn accidentally, therefore I never bother locking it. You can lock it if you're really paranoid, but it's firm enough that it doesn't get hit accidentally. So with the camera on, we can see this is the aperture down here. Right now it's set to f2.8. If I scroll the back dial here, you can see it's going to adjust the f-stop number for me. Scrolling to the right, let me select all the way up to f22. Scrolling to the left, it lets me select f2.8. If you want to see the effect of that change in aperture in real time, you'll have to hold down this depth of field preview button, the lower button here. So I can hold that down, and as I scroll to the right, let's see, at f2.8, focus in the foreground. The background there is very blurry, but if I raise the f-stop number, we can see it becoming sharper and sharper in real time. Obviously, aperture is a really important setting for photographers. It gives you creative control over the depth of field, whether you're isolating the subject from the background or making the background a part of the story and providing that extra context. It's a creative decision that you as the photographer have to make. Don't leave it up to the camera. Shutter priority lets you control the shutter speed, how long the shutter is open, how long the camera is gathering light. Fast shutter speeds, like 1/4000th of a second, freeze motion, but they don't let in a lot of light, which can cause more noise in the camera. Slower shutter speeds, like 1/60th or even 2-3 seconds, really long exposures, let in a ton of light, but they also show all the motion. If there's something moving in the frame, you'll see a long, blurry trail. I can suggest a couple of different shutter speeds. If you're shooting really fast action, like a small flying bird, a sparrow or a hummingbird, you might want to be at 1/8000th or 1/4000th of a second. Bigger birds like vultures, osprey, eagles, I like to be at 1/2000th of a second. For things like adult sports, like professional sports, I will usually shoot that at 1/1000th of a second. That's enough to show just a little bit of motion in things like fastballs, which looks better, but it freezes most of the important motion and gives you sharp images. If you're photographing like high school sports, I'll be at 1/500th. For, I don't know, middle school and younger, I might be at 1/250th, 1/125th for sports. General shooting, portraits and such, depends on the light, depends on the subject, how fast they're moving, but 1/60th is good for general shooting. And then things like night photography, it's gonna vary a lot depending on the light. For stars, you usually wanna be at a full 30 seconds. Night photography in rural environments, you might be at 2-3 seconds. In urban environments, you might still be at like 1/10th of a second. If you want to control the shutter speed and thus how much action you're seeing in the frame, you'll set the mode dial to S for shutter. And now I can control the shutter speed using the back dial here. So you can see as I scroll to the left, this is the shutter speed here. It's at 1/40th. It gets slower and slower and slower. And finally, when I'm at 1 second, if I take a picture, you can see it took a long time to take that picture. Even though it let in a lot of light over the course of that second, it's not overexposed because the camera automatically adjusted the aperture to f22, compensating for that. So you're choosing to either adjust the aperture in aperture priority mode or the shutter in shutter priority mode, and then the camera will adjust the other. If I go up to a really fast shutter speed, like 1/2000th of a second, you can see the camera has adjusted the aperture to a lower number, f2.8, and if I take a picture now, it happens almost instantaneously. That's the secret of shutter priority. You, as a creative photographer, deciding how much motion you want to show in an image. There's no one right answer. I usually, if I'm shooting action, I'll have to take some pictures and then review them and see whether I'm showing too much action or not quite enough action. If you want to control both aperture and shutter speed at the same time, use manual mode, the big M on the mode dial here. Now, the back dial here still controls shutter, but the front dial will control your aperture. So now you can control both the aperture and the shutter speed, set them to whatever you want, decide how much motion you want with the shutter speed, how much background blur you want with the aperture, and then take a picture. And if you have it in auto ISO, the camera will still always properly expose your image for you. If you just want to know how to change the ISO right away because you're that kind of guy, the way I do it is I hit the OK button, and then I'll just hit ISO auto up here, and then use the front dial to set the ISO to whatever you want. But honestly, even as a working pro, I almost always use auto ISO because it's one less thing to think about, especially with the raw files. I can change them later if I happen to miss the exposure, but auto ISO exposure compensation is how I change things. By default, in either shutter priority mode or manual mode, you can use a maximum shutter speed of 60 seconds. So I can keep scrolling all the way to the left and get all the way to 60 seconds. If I need to go longer than that, you go into bulb mode, which is an old-timey term for when there was like literally a remote shutter bulb that you would squeeze. So if I click once more, you'll see the screen gets dim and it goes into bulb mode. The screen dimming is a brilliant move on Olympus's part because the only time you'd be shooting for a shutter speed of longer than 60 seconds is if you were in perfect darkness. So it gets dark so you're not completely blinded by it. Great move, right? If you hate that, hit the menu button and select whatever you want there, and then scroll up to bulb/time monitor, and then you can make the screen brighter. And I'll do that for now just so we can see the screen easier. So back to actually setting the settings. Scroll to the left until you get to bulb mode when you're in manual or shutter priority, and you can keep the shutter open as long as you want by holding your finger on the shutter like this. If I hold it there for 10 minutes, it'll keep the shutter open for 10 minutes and make a really bright picture. But that is really boring to hold your finger on a shutter button for so long. So you don't want to do that. You could hook up a remote shutter timer, but that would be a waste because Olympus has a better mode. If I scroll past bulb once more to live time, then I can specify exactly how long I want the shutters to stay open. And in fact, it will show me my progress in real time. So to set that, I'm going to hit the menu button here. And so now I'm in live time, and I'm going to select the first option here, which is how frequently will it stop the exposure and show me my current progress. You can choose, 1 second, have it show you progress every 1 second, all the way up to every 60 seconds. So for the sake of this, there's no penalty to using the 1 second interval. You'll just see it update a little more frequently. So I'm going to set that to 1 second. And now I'm going to go up to bulb/time timer and select that to the actual length of the shutter, length I want to keep the bulb open. So the shortest is 1 minute all the way up to 30 minutes. There's no reason you do more than a 30-minute exposure really. So I'll do a 1 minute exposure here. And now we can see the effect of this with live time selected here. Assume it's like night and I'm doing, star trails. I'm in the wilderness somewhere. I will press the shutter button and it's going to start taking a picture. It's going to be way too bright because we're in a bright room and not in the middle of the wilderness. But every 1 second, it's taking a picture and showing me the image and then continuing to stack it in. It's using the electronic shutter to do this. So you can see right here, it's keeping track of how long I've been shooting for and how many pictures it has shown me, and then it stops. So it only takes a certain number. It only shows you a certain number of frames, but it's continuing to shoot up to 34 seconds here. It's keeping track of this. Let me just say I've used a lot of cameras. This is a way more sophisticated bulb functionality than I found on any other camera out there. Thank you so much, Olympus, for providing like really smart software. Our exposure is almost done. And now what we see is the noise reduction is in progress. What this means is it's going to take a second picture with the shutter closed, and it will take the results. It's weird to take a picture with the shutter closed, right? But what it's doing is looking at the noise that the sensor produces even when it's not getting any light at all. It will then subtract that noise from the first image that it took and reduce the amount of noise that you saw in the image itself. That would ruin your star trails pictures if that was your goal. If you were taking star trails and stacking them as I described in chapter 10 in my book, Stunning Digital Photography. That's the way you should do it, really, rather than taking one long exposure. You'll just get better results, cleaner skies. So you wouldn't want noise reduction on while you were doing stacking, but you might for other types of night photography. I'll show you how to turn off that noise reduction. To turn off the noise reduction, go into the menu, go to the gear icon, E-M1, and then go down to noise reduction and turn off. So now when you take a bulb mode image, it will not do that. So now I have it set to auto. Let's take a moment and plug my books. Stunning Digital Photography is the #1 best-selling book in the world for many years now. Hundreds of thousands of people have bought it. Go to Amazon and check the reviews. You'll see over 2,000 reviews with a 5-star average rating. So people really like the book, and it's because I put a lot of work into it. It has over 14 hours of video built into it. It has a Facebook support group where supportive, nice people, it's possible on the internet, will help answer your questions. They'll give you feedback about your images. And of course, the book itself covers just about every type of photography you can imagine, goes in depth into the technical stuff, but at the same time keeps it nice and friendly and easy and practical, because it's not so much about buttons and dials. It's about things like composition and lighting and timing and mood and expression. That's the art of photography. That's what makes great images. My goal in this video today is just to show you how to use your camera, but this is just buttons and dials. It'd be like if I taught you to drive by just showing you where the steering wheel and the brake and the gas were. You'd crash real fast, right? And the same thing will happen if you don't learn the artistic side of photography, and that's the #1 way to do it. So check it out. Amazon, or you can visit sdp.io/store. Believe it or not, the ebook is only $10, and that includes all those videos and all those other benefits. The paperback book is like $20. And if you get into post-processing, we have books on Lightroom and Photoshop. Same deal. They have a ton of videos built into them, Facebook support groups that'll really help you out. And if you just have questions about lenses and gear, or you just want to know how things like ISO really works and what differences crop factor and sensor size really make, check out my photography buying guide, a big, thick encyclopedia. I have a ton of information there about all recent Micro Four Thirds cameras and lenses. Thanks for checking those out and for supporting us. Let's talk about the different shutter modes. By default, when you take a picture, you hold the shutter button down. It will only take one picture for you. I got to get this out of bulb mode. Snap a picture takes one picture. If you're shooting sports, you probably want to take a bunch of pictures, right? Here's how you switch the shutter mode. There's a dedicated button up here on the top dial for it. See, it looks like a stack of copies. That's the international symbol for shutter. So push that, and now I can move this back dial here to switch between an insane number of shutter modes. Olympus gives you so many options. The first one here is single, where it takes one picture. I really never use that. The second one is single silent. Anytime you see the heart symbol, that means the shutter is going to be silent, like completely silent. No little shutter sound, nothing. So now when I take a picture, and if you're ever in a wedding, just please turn silent mode on in general. The one downside to silent mode is all silent modes use an electronic shutter. The difference between the mechanical shutter you hear with this. There's literally a flap that comes down. The mechanical shutter will prevent rolling shutter. And if you don't understand rolling shutter, my photography buying guide discusses that. But basically, rolling shutter will mean that moving subjects will appear at an angle rather than straight up and down. And on this camera, it's not that bad, but I find for things like sports, even like soccer, it's enough to pretty much ruin an image. What will happen is a ball that should be round will end up, if somebody's kicked it, it will end up looking all like weird and like elliptical. So in those cases, if you're shooting fast action, you'll want to turn silent mode off because you will get better images. But for subjects that aren't moving super fast, things like portraits, street photography, silent mode is great. And in fact, for a lot of wildlife, if it's a bird perched and you're getting really close, silent mode will make sure that you don't disturb the birds unnecessarily. So the mode that I usually use is sequential high here is for sports and action, fast moving subjects that will shoot really, really quickly. Silent high will also shoot really, really quickly. It's actually shooting now. You can see it's stuttering just a little bit. It shoots really, really fast. And it might often be too fast for you. So we can slow it down a little bit and go down to sequential low or silent low. So if I go to sequential low here, still pretty fast, but that low speed is right. That's where I like to shoot portraits at. Because if you take, 10 portraits a second, there's not going to be that much difference between frames. But if you're taking 5 a second, that's enough to catch those kind of micro expressions where people are happy or a little bummed out, and it will give you more options. So if somebody blinks, you won't just have that one frame where they're blinking. You'll have several frames after that where they're not blinking. So for that reason, I pretty much always use one type of continuous shutter or the other. Now, there's a couple other options here. There's Pro Capture H and then Pro Capture L. What Pro Capture does is it starts taking pictures before you push the shutter. It's great for things like sports. So it'll start taking pictures when you have the shutter pushed halfway like this. Like right now it's shooting, and you can see this little green light will appear here. It's already taking pictures, and then once I push the shutter all the way, it's actually writing them. So what it does is eliminate any sort of shutter lag. Because when you go to push the shutter, there's a split second, the tiniest fraction of a second before it actually takes the picture. So in Pro Capture, because it's capturing as soon as you get it halfway down, it's starting a split second before you actually push the shutter and then saving those images for you. If, for example, you're tracking a soccer player and you're not sure where you're going to shoot or not, Pro Capture is perfect because you can push the shutter button halfway and track them. And then if something good happens, if they kick the goal, you push that shutter. And then it's going to save all those images from the whole time you had the shutter halfway depressed. But if you don't push the shutter, then it won't save those images. It'll just get rid of them for you. So that way your camera isn't completely bogged down with all these kind of unnecessary images. Notice that Pro Capture, you don't hear the shutter. That means that it's using the electronic shutter rather than the mechanical shutter, which means it might not be good for really fast action. You're probably still better off using sequential high. A couple other shutter modes are the shutter timers here. So this little clock symbol here with the 12 seconds means a 12-second delay. That 12-second delay is going to be the right setting for when you set the camera up on a tripod and you want to run behind your family and put your arm around them and kind of be in the picture. And you can see the orange light here is blinking. And as it gets further down in the countdown, it's going to blink like this and then actually take the picture. So that's useful for those kind of tripod selfies. Another reason you might want to delay the shutter is if you're taking a macro shot. And in that case, you don't need to wait 12 seconds, but 1 second is usually enough. So by default, this custom shutter timer is set to 1 second, and it will take 3 pictures half a second apart. So you can select that and it will wait 1 second and then take 3 pictures. So that's perfect for those night photos where you want to just delay the shutter a little bit. You don't want to shake the camera by pushing it. And when you're done, always go back and select your sequential low or sequential high. We'll talk about the high res mode in just a second. If that sequential low speed was still a little bit too fast for you, you can go in and change that, either speed it up or slow it down, because the high speed is kind of super high. So I often go in and adjust that. To do that, I'll hit the menu button here and then scroll down to the custom settings. And under C1, I'll scroll to the right and you can see stack of copies L. I'll select that. And the max frames per second here is at 10 frames per second, which is still pretty high. So for me, I usually like to be more like 5 frames per second. And note that you have the option here to turn on a frame count limiter. This is kind of useful. It means you won't take more than 25 frames or some higher number that you might select. Sometimes the camera could be in your bag and turned on and the shutter might get hit, or you might set the camera down, upside down, and the shutter would get hit, and then it could take pictures until it ran out of batteries or filled up the card. And that might wear the shutter out if you were to take thousands of pictures accidentally. That's what the frame count limiter is for. If you don't do that, it's not that big of a deal. I don't think it's a super high risk type of situation. You also have the option of going in and setting the frame speed limiter for the high shutter speed. it's 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. Or notice the little heart there in the stack of copies. It's actually 60 frames per second when you're using the electronic shutter, which is super, super fast. So I can see you might want to dial that back to, 20 or 30 frames per second. But if you're shooting fast action, like, it's pretty easy to flip through and pick the perfect frame, and it's always kind of nice. But just be aware, you're taking 60 frames per second. It's gonna take a lot of pictures. That's a lot to dig through later. That's why you might want to dial that back. Let's talk about the focusing modes now. By default, in single focus mode, it will lock onto focus and then stop trying to focus. So notice I locked onto focus, and then if I try to focus on the background there, just nothing happens. It doesn't refocus. That isn't the behavior you want when you're shooting sports or any sort of action. You'd want the camera to keep up with a moving subject. Fortunately, it's super easy to change that. Hit this front button here. See it says AF. Hit that, and now using the back dial, we can scroll between SAF, which is single AF, or continuous AF. So with continuous AF, notice I'll focus on this screen here, the big M, and then as I go to the background, bam, it pops into focus. Back to the M, bam. So if somebody's running, it should be able to keep up with them, and I've had really good luck tracking moving subjects with this camera in CAF mode. Note that at the higher frame rates, continuous focusing can't keep up. So you might have to select the continuous low speed mode to get better results as far as tracking moving subjects goes. So let's hit this, and then we can scroll over to some of the other options. You can select manual focus here, but I generally prefer to do it by popping this lever on the lens back. You will also see options for single AF plus MF, or continuous, single AF plus MF. That means that you can at any point grab the lens and manually focus. So if you try to focus and it fails, maybe you're trying to focus through bars at a zoo and it focuses on the bars, you can just immediately grab the focusing ring and manually focus. Otherwise, it will just ignore your focusing input if you're just in SAF mode. So for things like that, I would be using single AF plus MF. Now, you also see options for CAF tracking and regular CF. So CAF here, if you're using the middle focusing point, it will just leave that middle focusing point selected and try its best to find any subject that you have that middle focusing point on. If you use continuous AF tracking, if the subject moves from the left part of the frame to the right part of the frame, it will try to follow that subject, which is really super important for things like sports and wildlife, where you, especially with big telephoto lenses, you can't always keep a single focus point right on your subject. It's just hard. So having the camera help follow it makes a big difference. And I found that it works pretty well. So for me, for sports, I'm in the continuous AF tracking mode most of the time. Now let's talk about the focusing points. So by default, the camera will use a single autofocus point. It'll lock on to whatever that is, and you can change that. So you can move that focusing point around just by using the directional pad here. Just push it up or down or left or right or wherever. Go all the way pretty much to the corners of the frame and then focus for off-center compositions. It works wonderfully. If you start scrolling like that, you can also change to use multiple focusing points. So you can kind of see now it's one point. I'm using the front dial here to change it, and I'm focusing on bigger and bigger areas. And what you're doing is you're allowing the camera to kind of pick anywhere in that range where it wants to focus. The only time I don't use a single autofocus point is if I'm following a flying bird in the sky with a clear background. If there's any sort of complex background and you use a big autofocus point, then you're just telling the camera, hey, if you happen to see the background in there, you can focus on that. So only when there's no background, a blue sky, do I use like all autofocus points to track a moving subject. While I'm adjusting these focusing points, you can use the back dial here to change the eye focus. So look right over here on the left, you'll see a little happy face and it says eye. That means it will find the nearest eye in the frame. The I stands for eye like EYE. The nearest eye in the frame and focus on it when there's a face. Or you can pick from IR for the right eye or IL for the left eye. Or you can have it ignore your eyes and just focus on the face, which you would never want to do. So the default is always going to be the correct thing. Happy face, eye. and I'm going to put on a proper portrait lens. This is my favorite Micro Four Thirds portrait lens, one of my favorite lenses ever, the 75mm f1.8 from Olympus. And oh, this is like the sharpest lens I've ever used. It's so sharp. So I'm gonna put that on, and now, okay, see how it's drawing a little green box on her eye when I depress the shutter? It's finding her eye and focusing on it. So that can make a portrait workflow happen so much more quickly. There are definitely scenarios where it won't find the eye when you might hope it would, but generally it means you don't have to be moving that focusing point around to find the closest eye, and that means that your portrait session will go by much faster. It means you'll miss focus a lot less than you would on a DSLR. I've covered this before, but manual focus on most Olympus lenses, you just pull it back and now you can manually focus. If you're using a Panasonic lens or some other Micro Four Thirds lens, again, you can just hit the AF button here on the back here and then scroll over to MF, and that'll make sure that you are manually focusing, or you can use single autofocus plus manual focus. Briefly talk about metering modes. Metering modes are the logic that the camera uses to determine how bright or dark your image should be when you're in an auto exposure mode or using auto ISO. If you want to change your metering mode, there's this button here. See, it says AF and then it has that weird symbol that for some reason has come to mean metering. You can push that and then push the front dial here to change your metering modes. I never change the metering mode. I always use what's called ESP mode, which evaluates the whole scene and makes a smart decision about it. I discuss metering modes in chapter 3 of Stunning Digital Photography, but for the most part, you can just leave it at that default. I just wanted to show, those of you who are like old school and want to use spot metering, I just wanted to show you how to get there. Another key aspect of exposure besides aperture and shutter speed is ISO. Go to sdp.io/ISO if you don't understand ISO, or if you think I should be saying ISO. I promise. I've talked to ISO, they say ISO, and I'm going to say it like ISO does. ISO determines basically the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. So high ISO, like ISO 6400, means that the camera will properly expose an image even in dim conditions or with a really fast shutter speed. A low ISO, like ISO 200, requires more light but produces cleaner images. So if you're outside in the sun, you might use ISO 200. If you're in a dimly lit environment, you might use ISO 3200 or ISO 6400. But you don't have to worry about ISO because the camera's set up by default to use auto ISO, and that's pretty much where I always leave it. If you're shot back in the film days, you might remember getting like 100 speed film, 100 ASA, 100 ISO film for outdoor shooting. It's exactly the same situation. It's just now virtual. The easiest way to change the ISO is to just hit the OK button here, which brings up the shortcut menu, and then it's in the upper left here. So you can select that and then just really quickly use the front dial to scroll between different ISOs, or you can select it and manually browse through everything. ISO low here drops the camera to ISO 64. It's an extension, but it works perfectly fine. If you're shooting RAW and you're used to being able to recover highlights, when you're using the low, you will not be able to recover those highlights. When you're using ISO 200, you will. So just if you're using low, make sure you don't clip the highlights. So check your histogram. But otherwise, the low ISO extension is totally fine to use. But for the most part, I'm going to scroll over to the left here and use auto ISO and just be totally happy with that. This is a bizarre user interface thing, but if you haven't set this back dial to be your power button, then you can also change the ISO using that dial. So flip this up, and now I can use the front dial here to change my ISO, and the back dial by default will change the white balance. And that switches up here. Front dial changes ISO, back dial changes white balance. I don't use that. That's just not how my brain works. So that's why I assigned this to the power button, because I don't ever need to switch that. I just wanted to show you where that was. Let's talk about exposure compensation. In aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode, or if you're using manual mode with shutter priority, the camera is still determining the brightness of your image using auto exposure. If the camera takes a picture and it's too dark, it's just darker than your taste, thinks it should be, or if it's too bright, you can fix that with exposure compensation. So as I'm looking at the screen here, you can see the screen itself is gray, but the screen should be white. This is white as I look at it. It seems white. So I want this to be nice and bright. If you look at the histogram here, that's why a histogram is important. You can see the whole right third is completely empty. That's a sign of an underexposed picture. The camera's smart, but it's not smart enough to figure out every scenario. So to adjust that, I'm going to use the front dial here and just scroll it to the right until I get the brightness that I want. And you can see I can preview it in real time using either the back screen or the viewfinder up here. So I'm looking at the histogram, I'm looking at the overall brightness and just making sure that it's exactly where I want it to be. If you're in manual mode, it will remember the exposure compensation that you dialed in a different mode. But by default, it doesn't let you change it. So if you want to change it, the easiest thing to do with the default settings is just to switch to a different mode and then dial in that exposure compensation. And then you can switch back to manual mode. Now let's talk about bracketing. Bracketing takes multiple pictures at different exposures. So if you bracket, it'll typically take the first picture at what it thinks is the proper exposure, and then it will take a second picture that's underexposed and a third picture that is overexposed. In the modern era, in the film era, you used to do this because you couldn't see your results immediately and you wanted to be sure that you got the shot. So you would take 3 or 5 pictures bracketed, and then when you went back to develop your film, you would just pick whichever one turned out the best. In the digital era, the reason we do this is typically because we're going to blend multiple exposures and we want to pull out the most detail from both the highlights and the shadows. You can do this manually or you can use automated HDR software. You access bracketing using the same button as the shutter speed, or the shutter mode. It's the top dial here with a stack of copies. See, it says HDR, high dynamic range. So I'll push that, and now I can use the front dial here to either choose one of the HDR modes, which will blend those pictures in camera, or standard bracketing if you want to do that on the computer yourself. So you can see here, this mode says 3F 2EV. That's going to take 3 frames at plus or minus 2 stops. So first picture properly exposed, second picture 2 stops underexposed, third picture 2 stops overexposed, and then we have 5 frames plus or minus 2 stops, 7 frames plus or minus 2 stops. And then we can also do 3 frames at 3 EV or 5 frames at 5 EV. I would usually do 3 frames at 3 EV for most situations. If I'm shooting into the sun or there's some extreme dynamic range, or I just want to be confident that I get every bit of the scene, I would pick 5 frames at 3 EV. That'll just capture even more. So just to quickly, I'll select that just so I can show you how that works. Now I'll push the button and you can see it took 5 pictures there. If I review these pictures, let's go back to the first image. You can see this was its auto exposure. This is the second picture, which is 3 stops underexposed and then 3 more stops. So 6 stops underexposed. The third picture is 3 stops underexposed. The fourth picture's 3 stops overexposed, and then the last picture is 6 stops overexposed. So with software, you could blend that later. That's how it works. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the techniques for blending multiple exposures and using HDR, chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography. Check that out. If you use a flash, this does not have a built-in flash. However, you can connect a flash into the hot shoe there. Olympus makes flashes. You can also use other flashes, standard in manual mode. If you have a Canon flash, you can pretty much connect it in and use it. If you want to adjust the flash exposure compensation to make the flash brighter or darker, I just want to show you where that is. Hit the OK button here, and then we're going to look for the international symbol for flash exposure compensation, which is right there. It's a little lightning bolt and then plus or minus. So you select that and then you can click OK and dial that flash exposure compensation up or down. For me, I will usually dial in negative 1.3 for like typical portrait work, because I find most cameras just output too much flash by default. White balance. If you ever take pictures and everything looks a little yellow or a little blue or a little green, that's because your white balance is off. This camera and all cameras have auto white balance, which works like your brain. Your brain sees these different colors, but then just tricks you into thinking that it still looks white, even if you're just under yellow light or green light or blue light. Auto white balance does that on your camera, and you know what, it's fine. It's fine almost all the time. And if it gets it wrong, it's super easy to fix in an application like Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom image editing app. even if you're shooting JPEG or RAW, it's pretty easy to fix. But in the event you do actually want to change the white balance, I find the easiest thing to do is to hit the OK button here, and then the second icon up here, WB Auto. If I select that, I can just pick the type of lighting that I'm in currently. Fluorescent, incandescent, cloudy, shadow, whatever, sunny, and that'll fix it. But again, I always leave that in auto because that's just one less thing I have to think about at the time I'm taking pictures. Let's talk about high-res mode, which is my absolute favorite feature of this camera. This camera will produce 80 megapixel files with unbelievable amounts of detail. It blows away the Canon 5DSR. It blows away these medium format cameras. The one trick is you have to use a tripod. And I'll suggest a couple of tripods at the end of this video. But it produces amazingly detailed images, and it's really easy to use. So you'll put your camera on a tripod, and then let's hit the shutter mode button up here, shutter mode. And then I'm just going to scroll. Let's turn HDR off. And then I'm going to scroll over to high res shot, the last option there. Another way to get to that is to just click OK here. And then this setting right here is just this, it does the same thing. It just allows you to select the shutter mode in case you forgot where that button was. You can get to everything from the OK menu. So now I'm in high res shot mode. You can see this blinking icon here is telling me that I'm in high res shot mode. When I press the shutter, it's going to take 8 sequential images. Moving the sensor very slightly, half a pixel between each of those things, will eliminate the effects of the Bayer filter, B-A-Y-E-R, which is the red, blue, and green filter, so that every pixel gets the entire spectrum of color captured. It will stack these images, reducing noise to essentially nothing, and it will give me kind of like in between pixels, actually increasing the resolution beyond all the way to like 80 megapixels. So I need this on a tripod for it to work, but just for the sake of example, I'll take it, and you can see the camera says busy. It spends a little time processing because it does have to stack these images together. I would definitely suggest shooting RAW for this. So I want to go in here and select the 50 megapixel fine plus RAW option here. If you're doing high res, you might as well get all the detail you possibly can. Select that. That will produce outrageously big files, but incredibly detailed files. Because by default, it will shoot JPEGs. They're beautiful JPEGs, but you might as well be able to take advantage of that extra shadow and highlight detail that it captures. Definitely turn off, I forgot, definitely go in and turn off high-res shot mode after you're done, because otherwise, the next time you go to take a picture and it might be handheld, it'll try to be stacking images and it'll waste your time. So turn that off when you're done with it. This camera is also an awesome video camera. It shoots 4K at 30p. It has optical and electrical, or sensor stabilization and electrical stabilization. And frankly, the video out of it is better. It's like class leading. I even kind of like the color a little bit better than the GH5. So I'll show you how to just record video real quickly. The mode dial here has what looks like an old-timey video camera here. See it? So you'll select that, and now the camera's in video mode. And you can see what it's doing is it's cropping the screen to 16:9, which is kind of the standard video format. And it's showing me audio levels up here, so I can see myself talking. If those were peaking, you'd want to turn it down a little bit, but those levels look pretty good. I can change the info on the screen, of course, by hitting the info button, just to clear it out if you want to just focus on the composition. And in the upper left, it's telling me how much room I have. Right now, I can record 54 minutes of video. You can real quickly change the video mode by hitting the OK button and scrolling down to this option here. So right now you can see by default, it's recording to card 1 at 4K 30p. I always leave it at 4K 30p. If you want a different resolution, you can select that and then scroll through here. You can drop to 1080 at 60p, super fine or fine compression. These will take up less space, which might be okay for something really casual. If you scroll over to the right, you can actually get into C4K mode, which is 4096 by 2160. That is the cinema 4K. So 3840 by 2160 is what most YouTube videos are at. That's what TV is at when it's in 4K. The Cinema 4K is 4096 by 2160, and it's slightly a wider format. That also drops you down to 24 frames a second, which, not coincidentally, is what most films are at. So for our sake, I'm going to leave it at 3840 by 2160 because that's just what I like. Now you'll notice that when you're in video mode, you can't select program, aperture, shutter, or manual mode. It's really weird that they do it this way. This is one user interface element I don't love, but you're in video mode. If you want to change from program to aperture priority mode or whatever, hit the menu button and then go up to this little video camera icon here, and now you're in the video menu system. So if you want to change from program mode to aperture or shutter or manual mode, you'll do it here. We will usually use manual mode because otherwise the camera will automatically change its exposure while it's filming, and it can look pretty crummy. If somebody in a black jacket walks through the back of the frame, it might brighten up the entire exposure. So usually I set it to manual mode and then nail the exposure before I start recording. There's an option here for what you want the AF mode to be, whether it's continuous focus or autofocus. So you'll see most of the settings that you're used to in still mode are kind of duplicated under this menu mode, and thus you might have to go in and set them separately. You can even control what the buttons and dials do separately. This option here, movie microphone icon, it controls your audio level. So select that, and you'll always want it on. That will record some sound. And now you can record the volume from either the microphone or the built-in microphone. So if I'm talking too loudly and it's peaking like that, I'm going to go in and dial it down like that so that even if I talk loudly, it doesn't blow it out. But for the most part, 0 is probably going to work in most situations, but if you see peaking, that's where you're going to go into. You can also adjust the headphone volume here. If you're listening via headphones, which you should be if you care about your sound, and it's too loud, you'd go in and select it up or down there. That pretty much sums up what you can do with the video. Let's talk about how to format a memory card. At some point, you're going to fill up your memory card, and then you'll want to import all your pictures into a computer, back those up to the cloud, and then you can reformat and reuse your memory card. To format a memory card, hit the menu button, go over to the wrench icon, and then the first item up here is card setup. Select that, select which of the 2 cards you want to format, and then you can choose format here. All erase, just use format. Let's talk about shooting RAW versus JPEG. By default, the camera is configured to shoot JPEG files, which are heavily compressed, but easily shareable. Almost all the pictures you see on the internet are JPEG. RAW files capture way more detail. JPEG files actually throw out a bunch of detail that's hidden in the shadows and the highlights. And if you're serious about photography and you're doing post-processing in something like Adobe Lightroom, then you'll want to be sure to be able to recover that information. So for that reason, I almost always shoot RAW. Unless I'm shooting fast action like sports where I'm taking thousands of pictures and the file size would get to be unmanageable, or I might run out of buffer space, I'll be shooting RAW. For detailed information about the difference between RAW and JPEG, visit sdp.io/rawvjpeg. If you want to just set the RAW versus JPEG settings, hit the OK button here, and then scroll over. These 2 settings here set the RAW or JPEG value for each of your 2 memory cards, card 1 and card 2. I can select that and then scroll through all the different options. If you're not sure how to process RAW files yet, but you think you might want to in the future, you could do RAW plus JPEG. And for that, I would pick LF plus RAW. The difference in JPEG modes between F and N is fine and normal. So fine is less compression. Files are bigger, but they might look a little bit better. A smooth blue sky will have less gradients in it. It'll just be smoother. And then you have 3 different JPEG file sizes you can choose from, large, medium, and small. Small is a tiny little thumbnail of an image, 1280, so you will never use that. And in fact, I would never use the medium either. It's only a 20 megapixel camera. So I pretty much always shoot things in large fine when I am shooting JPEG, even for sports. You've noticed as I've been using this camera, because I had to reset it to the default settings for this tutorial, it's beeping. That's the first thing I do when I pick up a camera is I turn off the beep. I encourage you to do that too. The easiest thing to do on this camera is to change the shutter mode to one of the silent modes. So push this top button up here with the little copiers on it, and then just go to like silent low speed mode. And now it makes everything silent, not just the shutter. If you want to use the mechanical shutter without that beeping sound, you can do that too. You can see now when I switch back to the mechanical shutter, both are making sounds. I'm going to hit the menu button. I'm going to go to the gear icon and then all the way down to D4. A lot of settings on this camera. I'm going to pick this little radiating dot. Sometimes they use words and sometimes they use icons, and I'll set that to off, and that will just turn off the sound. So now you can see it's focusing. The mechanical shutter is still working, but it's not making that sound. Let's talk about how to assign and customize all these function buttons. There are a lot of buttons on this camera, and I love being able to like make this function button do something unique because, you know, by default, this function button allows you to change the levels, which is, I would never do that in camera. I would always do that in post, so I would never change that setting. But I would like that button to be useful to me, like maybe let it change the ISO quicker. Here's how you do that. There's actually a shortcut menu for it. I'll hit OK here, and then in the lower right corner, I'll select button function, and it just takes me here really quickly. So this button up here is actually FN2. So let's scroll down to FN2. It calls it multifunction. I'll select that, and then let's change it to something I might actually use. Like magnify. So now that will be magnify for me. So I'll select that. And now when I hit this button, bam, it'll zoom in and allow me to check critical focus. And that's really a useful place for that magnify button. You know best what buttons you use more often. So as you find yourself digging through the menus or hitting that OK button and going to the same setting over and over again, take that task and assign it to one of the buttons that you can easily reach. Now, back button focus, the second thing that I set up on cameras, which decouples focusing from the shutter button. In other words, you're used to pushing the shutter button halfway and having the camera focus. Now it won't do that. Instead, when you want the camera to focus, you can push this button back here. This separates the focusing from the shutter button, which is useful in a lot of situations. If you ever need to focus and recompose, you won't have to, you'll be able to do that in continuous focusing mode. If you're struggling to focus on something, maybe in night photography in dim environments, and you don't want the camera to refocus automatically every time, you won't have to switch from autofocus to manual focus. It's hard to explain. I have a whole video on it at sdp.io/bbf for back button focus. It's also something I discuss in Stunning Digital Photography, but for now, I'll just show you how to set it up. I'll hit the menu button. And then under the gear icon, A1, I'll go up to AEL, AFL, and I'll scroll to the right. And now you can set it separately for single AF and continuous AF. So I pretty much only leave it in continuous AF mode. So I'll go ahead and select that first. And now you can scroll between different modes, and it's in mode 2 by default. So you can see halfway pushing the shutter button starts the AF. And what we want instead is mode 3. Now, pushing the shutter halfway will lock the exposure in, but pushing it all the way takes the picture, and pushing the AEL, AFL button does the autofocusing. So this is just back button focus. I'll click OK to set that. And now you can see when I push the shutter button halfway, it is not focusing. But when I push the back button, bam, it locks into focus. So now I can easily leave it here and refocus and take a picture. That wasn't a great example of why you might want to use it, but it is a good example of how it works. I promise, spend a week using back button focus and you will never want to switch again. Wi-Fi. This camera can act as a wireless access point and communicate to your smartphone or tablet, sending pictures over as you take in or giving you remote control. The first thing that you're going to want to do is to get the Olympus app installed. So I'm going to go into my app store here and search for, I think it's called OI Share. And that's it there, Olympus Image Share. So notice that it has 2 stars. No camera manufacturer has managed to make a great app. The Olympus app is pretty good. It's better than most of them. I've already had it installed, it's free. So I'll open it up now. But all camera manufacturers, their app kind of sucks. So you probably don't have a lot of 2-star apps installed on your smartphone. I'm just kind of setting expectations where they should be. But nonetheless, it works, and I do use it when we're on vacation. I'll transfer pictures and do it that way. So with the camera on here, now that my app is installed on my phone, I'm just going to turn the camera on. So when you run the Olympus image share app for the first time, it's going to walk you through the the easy setup process. So you can see it gives you some basic instructions on what you can do. You can read that stuff because they very well might improve it. So I'll click Use Now, and now it's going to prompt me to scan a QR code. Do start Wi-Fi on your phone so that they can communicate. I'll go into the live view screen here and just push the Wi-Fi button in the upper left corner. You might have to hit the info button until you see it. Now the Wi-Fi is starting up and it's showing me that QR code. So on my phone, I'm just going to push scan here. It's going to ask for access to my camera. I'm on an iPhone, but the Android phone's about the same. And I scanned it. Now you can see it knows the SID, the name of the network, and the password, and it wants me to install the profile on the phone. This part might work a little bit different on an Android phone. It tends to be easier. So now it's prompting me to just be able to connect to this without having to type a password. So I'm hitting install here, and now I need to type my phone's PIN number. I don't want you to see that. It's secret. Okay. It warns me that the profile is not signed. That's okay. So I'm going to click install and click install again, and then click done. So now I have the ability to connect to the Wi-Fi network. I'm going to click back to OI Share here. It will open up the app for me again. So now my phone is ready to connect to the Wi-Fi network, but I'm at home. So there's another Wi-Fi network that it's connected to. If I were not connected to Wi-Fi, it would have seen the camera's Wi-Fi and automatically connected, but it wouldn't drop an existing Wi-Fi connection. So if I want to connect to the Wi-Fi, I'm going to have to manually connect to it. This wouldn't be the case on Android phones. They'll automatically switch, but for iPhones, you'll have to go into your Wi-Fi settings. It's the gear icon here, and then from the main menu, you'll select Wi-Fi here, and then select the one that says E-M1 Mark II. So with that selected, it is a secured network, so your pictures are being encrypted and such in transmission, but I don't have to type the password because that's what installing the profile did. So it's spinning, it's connecting, it's connecting. Okay, I see a check mark there, which means it's connected. Now I'll double tap that and switch over to OI Share. First thing I'll do is import some pictures. So now we can scroll through all the pictures that it's taken, and let's see if we can find something more interesting than the screen. Okay, here's a picture of our Lightroom book. I'll click import, and that will copy it over. It's going to ask for access to my pictures. Import complete. Turn off the camera, but I might want to go back and import some additional pictures like this sweet blurry picture of that. Okay. If you want to select more than one picture, you can select up here and then pick, 3, 4, whatever pictures you want. Select all, select none down here, and then click import. And it's going to bring all those in at once. So you can real quickly get all your pictures from your vacation transferred over while you're waiting for Starbucks to bring you your coffee. And now if I wanted to share them, I could just go into Instagram or whatever. They're just in my camera roll. I'll add a picture here, and you can just see there's the picture that I just took on the camera and transferred it over. Jumping back to OI Share, that's how you import pictures. There's other functionality too. You can go to remote control here, and it gives you a little overview of it. So I'll just use it in remote shutter mode. And now by pushing this, I can take pictures, or I could lock the shutter open, and it will just keep taking pictures. I know you're thinking you want to actually see what's going on the camera when you're taking pictures. That's just like a remote shutter trigger thing. It's a weird user interface they have, but hit the gear icon in the upper right corner and then select remote control. And instead of mode remote shutter, select mode live view. So now we can adjust some settings for how it's going to behave in live view mode. I'll go back, select done. And now when I select remote control, okay, so now I can see a live view feed. Look there I am. Look, it automatically rotated. If I want to take a picture, let's see if we can get Justin in here. If I want to take a picture, I'll hit the shutter button. I'll move these closer so you can see them. And then I can immediately import it. If I don't hit import, then it won't get transferred to the phone. You're just seeing like a preview here. So now it's actually on my phone, so I could immediately share that to Instagram. You can see I just got a failed to communicate with camera error. That's one of the reasons it has 2 stars. These kinds of things can just be a little flaky. I just reconnected to it. There are other settings here. You can see up in the upper right corner, it's showing a P mode, failed to communicate with camera. Go out and go back in. I can hit P mode here and switch to, say, Aperture Priority instead. And now I can go in and select that. I can select manual mode or video mode, adjust the exposure compensation up and down, fail to communicate with camera. And I can change the, whether I'm using a silent shutter, all the same settings that you get through the user, this mobile user interface. The other thing I want to show you is the add geotag function. Let's scroll that down a little bit. What this will do, if you turn that slider here on, is it will use your phone to record your location all the time, as long as you have that on. And then later, you can go back in, select this, and pick the log that you selected, and then transfer it to the camera. And it's going to send the log of where you've been to your camera, and then it's going to sync up those photos. So I didn't have it logging, or it would be able to sync it up. But if you start out your vacation day, you can turn that geotag on and then sync it later at the end of the day to your camera. It will use extra batteries on your smartphone, so just be aware of that. I find that I always forget to do that, and therefore almost none of my pictures are actually geotagged, just because I forget, or sometimes it just seems to have stopped at some point. But again, that's kind of why that app has 2 stars. When you're done with Wi-Fi, just hit the menu button on the back to stop it, because that is burning through some extra power on your camera, and it will kind of stay on indefinitely. Let's talk about manual focus assist. This can make it very easy to manually focus by instantly punching in, zooming in. To do that, to set that up, hit the menu button here, and then go to the gear icon, A3, and then you'll see MF Assist. So I'll select that, and then I can choose either magnify or peaking. Peaking highlights the parts of the image that are sharpest, and magnify zooms in. So let's do magnify here. And now what I'll do is I'll pop this lens into manual focus mode. And then as I start to turn the focusing ring, it zoomed way in. So let's zoom out so we can see it. I'll turn the focusing ring and bam, it just jumps right in. And now I can really be confident that I'm nailing focus. Pretty cool, right? The other option is peaking. I'll turn off the magnify and turn on the peaking so you can see the difference. You can have them both on. Now, if I zoom in here in the letters and then I pop the camera into manual focus and turn it, what you're going to see is red highlights around the letters. It's a little hard to see, but I can see it here. Can you see those little red highlights? So as I pull it back, the focus from the M to the F, you can kind of see that red just outlining the part of the frame that's currently sharpest. So if you ever use manual focus, I prefer the magnify, but the peaking can be useful too. If you're having a hard time seeing those outlines, you can go in and adjust them. To do that, hit the menu button and then go to the gear icon, D3, and you'll see peaking settings. I don't know why they separated these 2 things, but I'll scroll to the right here, and the top option is peaking color. I can choose a different color. Obviously, if you're taking a picture of a red dress, you wouldn't want it to be red. You might want it to be yellow. And then the highlight intensity, I find it easier to see if you set it to high. And then, of course, the image brightness adjust. You probably don't need to do that, but you could dim the whole image so it'd be easier to see. So now, let's see. If I zoom in on the letters and manually focus, you can see that now it's surrounded by yellow, and that yellow is a little bolder than it was before. I will say, with focus peaking, you can see parts of the image that are highlighted that are later slightly out of focus. You'll notice it when you get your pictures back on your computer, and you'll say, the eye was definitely highlighted with focus peaking, and now it's not in focus. That's the way it is. Focus peaking is a general guide, but it's not for precision. Use the magnify for precision. You might end up getting dust on the sensor. The camera will automatically clean the sensor by shaking it some, but sometimes you get just dust that really wants to stay on there. And that will show up as just kind of blobs in your picture, especially in empty parts of the frame. Like if you take a picture that has of the sky or an empty wall, you'll see little blobs. It's just dust on your sensor. You don't have to send your camera in to be serviced. You can clean it yourself. Just wanted to point you towards this link, sdp.io/sensor clear with a K. That's the way they spell it, and that's what I use to clean my sensor. For a detailed video showing you exactly how to clean the sensor with that tool, check out chapter 5 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography. This camera also has custom modes, which allow you to quickly restore a group of settings. So if you go in and customize your camera for sports, you might be using a fast shutter speed and continuous AF and a high mechanical shutter, but that's going to be different than if you're shooting portraits or landscapes. If you quickly want to be able to switch between those modes without going in and changing the shutter and the focusing and all that, you can assign that to these 3 custom modes that are available on the mode dial, C1, C2, and C3. So the first thing I'll do, let's set it up for sports. I'll put it in shutter priority. I'll set my shutter speed to 1/500th, my aperture as low as I can. Let's get the exposure compensation zeroed here. And then, for sports, I often will shoot JPEG. So I see it's already set to JPEG. And auto ISO is good. I'll set the focusing to AF tracking, so I'll select that. So now it's in my sports mode. I'm going to save these settings to C1, and then I'm going to remember that that's for sports. I will go down to the very first icon here, the camera 1, and then reset/custom modes. So I'll select that, and then I'll select assign to custom mode, and then I'll do custom mode C1. And I will set it. So now custom mode C1 is for sports. Let's go in and change some settings. Let's say I want to do portraits. I would probably choose aperture priority mode, the lowest f-stop I can get, and maybe I'd use single AF. Use what I would use for portraits. Now I would go into the menu, go to reset custom modes on the very first page, assign to custom mode C2 and set. So now C1 and C2 are set to sports and portraits respectively. If I change the mode dial to C1, we can see it's at 1/500th, f2.8, and continuous AF tracking. If I switch it to C2, it's now in aperture priority mode, f2.8, and single AF. I found these custom modes to be really, really useful. You're just quickly getting stuff done. Plus, like if I switch to portrait, sometimes I'll forget to change one setting or another. It's just nice to have everything kind of grouped together in there. Let's talk about lenses and accessories and stuff. I'm going to recommend some cool stuff you can buy that will make a difference in your photography. First, as I discuss lenses, I want to talk about the difference between Panasonic and Olympus lenses. Now, this is a micro Four Thirds camera, which describes this lens mount here. And it can take any micro Four Thirds lens can be attached to that, including, and the 2 main manufacturers of micro Four Thirds cameras are Olympus and Panasonic. There are others, but that's pretty much it. Any of them will attach. They should be able to autofocus and everything should just work just fine. But anytime you have the option, pick an Olympus lens over a Panasonic lens. The reason for that is that Olympus tends to build in profiles for their own lenses, but not Panasonic's lenses. Also, the hybrid image stabilization, which uses the lens and the sensor stabilization, tends to work better. Generally, you're just going to have a better experience when you use Olympus lenses on Olympus bodies. They also tend to have compatible weather sealing, which can improve the durability of your camera in bad conditions. So I put Panasonic lenses on it on a regular basis because I have them and I like them. But when you have a choice, if you're buying gear, choose the Olympus stuff. So let's go over some lens and tripod suggestions. The first thing I'll suggest is for a general all-around kind of vacation-y, one lens that does it all lens, I like the Olympus 14-150 lens. It's not super fast, it's not the sharpest lens, it's not the ultimate sports lens. It's just a great lens that does everything, and it's reasonably inexpensive. $600. It's not inexpensive, but you spend $2 grand on a camera, maybe you got $600 for a lens. Pick it up at sdp.io/0150. The lens that I use for my regular day-to-day shooting is the 12-40 f2.8. So that lets in about 4 times as much light as that previous lens at f5.6. So it's much better for low light. It'll also give you just a little bit of background blur on subjects. It's a great durable lens, pretty sharp, sdp.io/0400. The 40mm lens is $900. That's nothing compared to the $7 to 14 millimeter super wide angle lens, but this is an awesome lens. And if you're shooting landscapes, which this thing is great at, this is kind of the best one. Notice that big bulbous front element. It's a great lens. It's $1,300. And for super wide angle lenses, it's just your best option. One thing I really like about mirrorless systems is when you put big glass on them, they're still big. They're as big as DSLRs, but you have this option. You can get a little pancake lens like this and put it on the camera. And now you have a little tiny little travel camera. You can, you're out at dinner with your friends, you can put it on the table. It's not gonna take up half the table like a 5D Mark IV would or something. My favorite lens for that is the Olympus 20 millimeters. Try to pick it up used, but you can get them pretty inexpensively. Pick it up at sdp.io/020. If you're looking for portraits and you don't want to take up a lot of space, I really like the Olympus 45 millimeter f1.8. It's really small. Ooh. It's really small and light. It doesn't take up much room in a bag, but it's plenty fast enough to blur the background really nice. But if you're serious about portraits, I'm going to suggest this 75 millimeter f1.8 from Olympus. This is one of my favorite lenses of all time. It's outrageously sharp. We used this on the live show for the longest time. It was actually a little too sharp for 4K video. But for portraits, man, it will show every detail and it will blur the background like crazy, just like a full frame camera would. Fantastic lens. If you want something that's more like a zoom, either for sports or portraits, this camera here that I have, wait, where is it? Oh, here it is. The Olympus 40-150 Pro f2.8 is pretty good for general sports and portrait stuff, plenty of zoom on it, and it'll cost you about $1,500. Great quality lens. If you want more reach for wildlife or really distant sports, the 300 millimeter f4, whew, it's a heavy lens, but for the amount of reach you get, like a 600 millimeter full frame lens, it's really pretty good. It's got that same kind of locking ring on it. It's got image stabilization built into it, and it's $2,500. But you know what? Most pros spend way more money on their lenses than on their body anyway. Now, there's a fantastic selection of Micro Four Thirds lenses out there, but what we end up doing a lot is adapting Canon lenses, especially those Canon mount lenses, especially those made by Sigma, by using a Metabones speed booster. So you can adapt, you can put adapters on this that will allow you to attach just about any type of lens. Nikon, Sigma, heck, older Fuji cameras, like anything you can imagine you can stick on there, but you probably won't get autofocus. The nice thing about these Metabones adapters and speed boosters is they will give you okay autofocus, not native lens autofocus, but it'll be okay. They'll give you electronic control over the aperture, and you can even get things like the lens image stabilization to work. Now, that's a bit of a challenge with a full frame lens because the Micro Four Thirds sensor is much smaller than a full frame sensor. Therefore, you're only seeing the center part of the image, and your 50 millimeter lens would turn into a 100 millimeter equivalent, which would completely change the picture you were taking, right? So it would also reduce the overall sharpness of the image because it's not pulling that entire image area in. It's just zooming in. It would be like if you zoomed in really tight on an image, it wouldn't be sharp anymore. It's the same kind of thing. So what the speed boosters do is they take that entire image that's coming from the lens and they shrink it down to something about the size of the sensor. And the speed booster I recommend for the Olympus E-M1 Mark II is the Metabones 0.71x speed booster for Micro Four Thirds to Canon. They work best with the Canon lenses. You can adapt the Nikon lenses, but the Canon ones will get you far better autofocus and such. You can pick it up for about $430. Sometimes it's close, actually it's more like $600. Go to sdp.io/71sb. So Micro Four Thirds, when you put full frame lenses on them, it has a 2x crop factor. So your 50 millimeter lens behaves like a 100 millimeter lens. You should apply that to both. If you want to understand what your images will look like, you should apply it to both your focal length and your aperture. So a 50 millimeter f1.4 lens would take images like a 100 millimeter f2.8 lens. What the speed boosters do is they have a crop factor of less than 1. So Micro Four Thirds is a 2x crop factor. This speed booster is a 0.71 times crop factor, giving you an effective crop factor of 1.4. So this has now greatly reduced the crop factor that you'll be getting from these lenses, allowing you to use more of that lens surface area, gathering more total light, allowing you to shoot better in low light and giving you sharper images, and they work. We use them all the time for our video production, both on the Olympus and in the Panasonic GH5, and they work. But they're expensive, but they allow you to use these bigger lenses, which actually are a little bit sharper. Now, I would suggest using 2 lenses with these Metabone speed boosters. The first is the Sigma 18-35, which I cannot show you because it is filming me right now. That's how much we love it. It's like the main lens in our studio. It's about $800, which is an incredible value. That's less expensive than those Micro Four Thirds lenses that I just showed you, but it's way sharper and way faster. It's natively an f1.8 lens, but when you put on your speed booster, it's going to be an f1.2 lens. That's the aperture that the camera will see, which means compared to those f2.8 lenses, it's gathering more than 4 times the amount of light. So if you're shooting in low light with this wonderful 12 to 40 millimeter f2.8 lens and you switch to the speed booster in that Sigma 18-35, you will have less than 1/4 the noise at the same shutter speeds. Less. It's remarkable. Your images will also be sharper. I've compared the sharpness, and the Sigma and Metabone's combination blows away all the Micro Four Thirds lenses for sharpness. So if you're getting serious, I use Micro Four Thirds lenses when I'm shooting casually, but if I'm taking a landscape and I'm planning to make it huge, I'm using the Sigma and the Metabones. There are a couple of these super fast Sigma lenses. They're designed for APS-C, so they're not full frame, which is actually a good thing since these don't take these full frame lenses. The other one I'll suggest is the Sigma 50-100 f1.8, and this is a big heavy lens. I have it mounted in my GH5 here, along with the Metabone speed booster. You can see the Metabone speed booster goes between the camera and the lens itself and actually has optics built into it. So if I take that lens off, you can see the speed booster itself has these magnifying optics that refocus the light coming from it. This 50-100 f1.8 will behave like a Micro Four Thirds 35 to 71 millimeter f1.2, or in full frame equivalent terms, it would behave like a 70-140 f2.8 lens. So very fast, tons of background blur, and that was cost you about $1,100. Actually, like cheaper than those Micro Four Thirds lenses. Those are my lens suggestions. Let's talk about a tripod. You'll definitely want a tripod for that high res mode. If you're like me, you're using it for landscapes and stuff, so you wanted a travel tripod. We have 2 of these. Manfrotto sent us one, but then we bought a second one because Chelsea and I were always fighting over it. It's the Be-Free. We use the carbon fiber version, which is a little bit more, but check it out at sdp.io/Be-Free. It's just a great all-around travel tripod. We tested a bunch, and it was the best. If you get into video, this is a nice, heavier video tripod that I can suggest with a nice pan tilt head. Check it out at sdp.io/levelhead. And if another video suggestion, get an LCD screen cover, because while the LCD display is pretty nice and bright, in the sun, you're still gonna have a hard time seeing it clearly enough to really focus. So this little $20 cover will snap on, well, it Velcros on, but it'll help block out the light and make everything easier to see. If you want to record from an external mic, I'm gonna suggest this $10 breakout cable if you want to record from 2 microphones. I know it's kind of a niche thing, but we often record, both Chelsea and I, on camera. We can run 2 separate mics. One will go to the left channel, the other will go to the right channel, and then we can separate those easily and post to 2 mono channels. You don't care about this unless you're a serious video guy, but it's a $10 cable, sdp.io/breakout, and it will totally change the way you work. For wireless lavs, the one I'm wearing now, people always ask me what I'm using as a mic. It's the Sennheiser EW100 G3. Pick it up at sdp.io/G3. Little tip though, I wouldn't get any commission if you did this, but go to eBay and look for a Sennheiser EW100 G2. They're almost as good, and you can get them used for like $150, $200. They're really cheap. And finally, can help support us and learn the really important things about photography, the art of photography, the stuff that will actually make a great image, by reading my book, Stunning Digital Photography, the #1 photography book in the world. It includes 14 hours of video free, access to a Facebook group filled with friendly, supportive people who will answer your questions and give you feedback. It has hands-on practices at the end of every chapter, optional quizzes that you can take to just help reinforce your learning, and it's helped hundreds of thousands of people learn to love photography and get fantastic results. So many of them have even gone pro with our help. Of course, you'll need to do some post-processing. We have books on Lightroom and Photoshop, the two most popular photo editing apps. And we've tested all the photo editing apps. They're still what we recommend. They're the best things out there. And if you just want to understand all these lenses and everything, we've reviewed like all the recent gear, like hundreds of individual things. And I've crammed all that testing and knowledge into my photography buying guide. It will explain all these different terms, things like focus breathing and what exactly that means. It'll let you master crop factor and everything else you really need to understand. This book will save you thousands of dollars by helping you choose the right gear, helping you buy used gear without getting screwed, telling you what gray market is, stuff like that. Check it all out at Amazon. Just search for Tony Northrup, me, or visit scp.io/store, our own online store where we ship worldwide. Of course, subscribe for lots of free videos, 3 new videos every week, at least, sometimes more. Give me a like. And if you have any questions or if you have tips because you're an existing E-M1 Mark II owner, write a comment down below. Thanks. Bye.